Living Idris to me means, as a player, you can walk around the ship, you can soak in what everyone else is doing. Like, it's this sense that everyone's got their own life, their own sort of routine, their own personalities as well. Like, so, for example, if an AI is walking by a guy who he doesn't like, you know, he might not say hello, but if he walks by the player and he does like the player, you know, he's going to say hi, or he's going to go out of his way to sort of greet him and interact with him. So it's all like this minutiae, all this like minor details that make up the whole story of what like an AI can do.
What the Idris shows is that every NPC has a meaning, has a background story, and you can actually talk with them. They can tell you some, you know, rumors, or, you know, each of them has a different personality.
So the goal of the Idris was always to create a ship for people. And we want you to walk around the ship and see these people going about their lives, doing whatever their role is, and generally just doing what it is that they want or have to do. So in doing that, we have every character on the ship has their own name, their own rank, their own role on the ship. And that's spread among all of the different disciplines. So we have lots of bridge crew, engineers, gunners, deck crew, even janitors and medical personnel. And they're all spread out quite well considered, given wherever that role might be. And then we have to spread that out across different shifts as well. So you might see somebody doing a certain role or in a certain shift on one chapter of the game, but then on the next chapter of the game, they might be off duty and you'll see them in the mess hall talking to people. And everybody is doing their role on the ship regardless of where you are. So you could be at the complete other end of the ship and they'll still be doing their thing. It's not like they despawn as soon as you've turned the corner.
The day-to-day of an AI on the Idris is essentially governed by this concept of a schedule. So on a Monday, all this means is that on a Monday, someone might be a Marine and going about their business as a Marine might do. So he might go to the shooting range, he might go to the Idris Bridge and stand guard, do all this sort of stuff. Then on a Tuesday, he might be off duty. So all that means is he'll go to the mess hall if he's hungry. You know, he'll go and lay down if he's tired. He might go to the shooting range again if he's feeling like he wants to shoot some stuff. There's also things like arcade machines if he's feeling bored. And it's this idea that everything is kind of governed by what an AI wants to do. So, you know, again, if he's hungry, he's going to go eat. If he's tired, he's going to go lay down. We just give them options and then they go do it depending on what they want to do.
Our game has this kind of huge opportunity to be a simulation in first place. So you want to feel real. And having a character that stays there forever, it doesn't really feel real.
For example, we might have a Marine who by default is supposed to be on a guard post, and he will go to the guard post, but if somebody else is already on the guard post, he may say, oh, well, I can't do that. So he'll decide he wants to go do some training, either at the shooting range or just simply running around the ship and doing that sort of thing.
We really want that the AI can tell a story to the player. So to achieve this, of course, there is not just one tool that can do it, or one feature, let's say. We try to embed inside the subsumption tool a lot of different functionalities so that designers can create a behavior that can tell a story. We want to have the systemic behavior to feel real, two characters talking in the mess hall and not just eating. Three guys walking together, or two joggers running around, and while they run, they try to keep their pacing and talk about something. But you also want a mission to tell its own story. So on top of the regular systemic behavior, you might need the story to follow a specific storyboard. If we look at the prisoner scene, that I think is particularly fantastic in the live stream, that achieves very well. So you arrive to the pilot room, you start to talk with Old Man, and then there is a moment in which if you don't interact with the game takes control. And it just, you have this really cinematic moment. You can look at the face of the character, you're just not listening from very far. This brings more immersion. And the immersion is kept persistent with the fact that you still are in control if you want to move around, interrupt the cinematic camera, and then you can go close to the prisoner and actually look at them, and they are actually performing all their actions. The mission, on the other way, can also tell the characters suggestion of what to perform next. So after you take off from the Idris, you want all men to fly towards the next position for the next mission to do, right?
So the activity setup we've been doing has been really interesting over the last few months. We've done a big refactor of all the guys on the Idris. We've got guys like Marines, engineers, off-duty characters, bridge crew, all the deck crew guys, even janitors. And the way I've been approaching it is I would sort of role play it a little bit. So when I'm setting up, say, an engineer, I would think like, what's an engineer going to do today? Like, what's his job? Is he going to inspect all the ship parts, see if they're broken? If they are broken, what's he going to do then? Is he going to call up a repair guy, ask him to come and repair it, and then like move on, and all this sort of stuff? And once I've got like this big, clear picture of a day-to-day of what an AI can do, I'll start setup. And I'll just start from like ground one, like, he gets out of bed, puts his clothes on if he's not dressed already, and goes about his job.
Designers can actually give assignments. So an assignment can be, I suggest you or I request you to fly to this position. I request you to defend the player from this fight. This is very similar to what, in a systemic situation you also have as a wingman commands, right? So the system is going to be very similar for the player and for a designer to ask the AI to do something. An assignment doesn't need to be necessarily a full behavior, like defend an area or defend the player, but it might be a suggestion. It might be, I really want you to fly as close to the player as possible. So you can just execute your normal behavior, but telling the story that the mission wants. It might be that in that moment, all man has to fly next to you because you are in a very low health state and you need protection. And we can communicate these to the system behaviors through assignments.
In the prisoner arrival scene, Lars, who's on the elevator doing his guard duty, now suddenly there's a group of prisoners about to arrive. So Lars is then informed of this, and at that point he suddenly says, right, well, I've got to go down to the hangar and make sure to basically guard them as they arrive. So he will suddenly leave his behaviour and then be told that his priority is to go and make sure that these prisoners arrive safely. So he will then walk down to the hangar and he will basically wait in the hangar until this ship with the prisoners arrives, basically. And it'll be the same for the other guards who are there as well. And then likewise, when the cinematic scene is finished, we obviously need to seamlessly blend them out of this cinematic sequence and basically put them back into their natural behaviours. So at this point, like, Lars is then given a completely new objective, which is to basically go off and prepare the holding cells for the prisoners that have arrived. So after the cinematic sequence takes place, Lars is then put back into a new behaviour, and his behaviour is then told that he needs to prioritise sorting out the holding cells, so he'll then wander up to the brig and then start doing a completely different behaviour, which is again all part of his natural life.
All the things that you see happening in the Idris are real, are actual behaviour running. So from our perspective, it's really interesting to create tools that allow you to create a lot of content that is not fake. For example, talking about repairing an instrument in the Idris. That process basically evolved during our development. So it started as a bit more like an engineer work that goes around, search for object to repair, and then it just repairs them. But that felt a bit too much robotic. So with the designer, we looked at this and we were like, well, what it would be interesting is to try to have like a lead engineer that goes around, inspects objects, and then he calls repairing engineering work. So like you will see him going around, look at stuff, then talking and calling out another NPC. This NPC will come and he will repair, and maybe the lead engineer will be there to inspect that the work has been done correctly. And this is really what is described in the behaviors and in the subsumption activities and sub-activities. So you can imagine the subsumption activities to be the regular job that the schedule is assigning the different NPC to do, and then the sub-activities are the actual kind of action. So it's like an engineer can repair something, or can inspect something, or can just going around because it gets cold, and this is like the way we describe the flow and the content in subsumption.
One bit of tech that we made as part of the secondary sub-activity sprint is this ability to trigger something based off what the player is looking at. So for example, as you're roaming around a place like the Idris, as a player you might be interested in things like the engines underneath like the coolant or piping that carries power all across the ship. What this tech does is say, if the player's looking at these things, the other AI nearby are going to notice that. They're going to pick up on it, and then they're going to talk to the player about it. So anything that the player might be interested in, you know, they can get information about it just by looking at it. You know, in the same way that, you know, if you were looking at something in real life and some other guy knows all about it, he might pick up on that fact and talk to you about it. So there's the ability for it to feed into missions and gameplay in any way that we want, really. Say, you know, a big explosion happens, or say there's some fire going off as you're walking down a corridor, or running down a corridor, I should say. An AI might comment on that and say, like, oh, this is on fire because of this, you know, and that might have gameplay implications. So the way the POI tech works is it's basically just a raycast from the player, and all that means is just like a line drawn from the player's eyes to any objects right in front of them. So, for example, the engines that the player might be interested in because he's looking at them, this raycast would happen. A little timer would go off, and any AI interested or knows about that thing that the player's looking at nearby, they'll wait for that timer to go down. Once it's gone down, they'll get an event, and that will trigger some logic to say, oh, the player's interested in that, so I'm going to try and talk to the player about that, you know, and give them some information because it seems like they're interested.
So as we're building the tech, we want the AI to be more aware of one another and to react to one another in more intelligent and systemic ways. Like similar to the spoil tech, we don't necessarily want to know what they're going to say or do, which makes it more interesting for everybody. And one of those ways might be to react to one of your own attributes. Like say you hadn't taken a shower and you were a bit smelly, then the AI might comment on that.
Maybe even take a shower. One nice thing about the older engines on the Stanton, plenty of hot water to go round.
One of the things that we're very aware of is how repetitive and jarring something could be if it's said again and again and again, every couple of moments, like Lieutenant.
Lieutenant, Lieutenant, Lieutenant.
So, yeah, we're trying to avoid that.
So SPOIL stands for Systemic Point of Interest Look Tech, and it's basically our way of giving an AI the ability to look at interesting things. So, for example, an engineer, he might be interested in things like wall panels that he can fix, or monitors that display the status of the ship. He's going to look at those things. He's going to be super interested in them. Whereas a Marine, you know, he doesn't care about that stuff. He's bothered about weapons and, you know, the armory and the brig and that stuff. So he's not going to look at all the stuff an engineer might be interested in and look at all the stuff that he's interested in. Similarly, on places like the bridge, the pilot of an Idris, for example, he might look at approaching ships. So because that's something that he's actively interested in, he doesn't want ships to like collide with him. So Spoiler's going to allow him to take a look at those ships and maybe watch out for him.
It's all part and parcel of our layered animation systems that we have. So the very basics of that kind of system would be you'd have an AI character walking down one of the passageways, and that's all well and good, but then you might want to have them walking down the passageway whilst also scratching their arm, and that would be laid on top of that initial walk. Now, spoil is a way for us to mark up anything in the game as a point of interest. So then the character would be walking down the corridor, they'd be scratching their arm, but they could also be looking up at a screen as they walk past it. And that was really great because it means that you don't know what the character's going to be looking at any given time. And that makes it more interesting for us because we don't know either.
Every AI has their own personality. And part of what that means is if the player interacts with AI in like a negative or a positive way, the AI are going to pick up on that and treat the player differently. So for example, if the player just straight up punches an AI, you know, that AI isn't going to say any more greetings to that guy because, you know, he punched him. Whereas if the player maybe fetched something off a mission and gave it to the AI as a request, the AI is going to think more positively of that character. And therefore, he's not only going to say like a greeting to him, he might say like a really positive greeting, or he might stop in his tracks and try and talk with the player. So it's this idea that every player's journey through a squadron is going to be slightly different. You might have one player whose relationship with Morrow is really positive, and Morrow gives him like loads of gossip and stuff like that. Whereas another player's journey might be super negative towards Morrow. Like Morrow essentially hates the player. And that's always reflected through things like ward lines, spoil tech, the way AI interacts with the player in general.
A really good example of spoil tech is whilst I was designing the executive officer behaviour on the bridge. Now she's in charge of everybody and she's got to walk around and she's going to be observing people, just generally walking around, making sure everything's going well. And that was all nice, but it felt a little bit flat and wooden at times. So you might want her looking at something, but she would potentially just looking straight ahead. Whereas now, with spoil tech, we could have it so that if she was looking out a window, she could be looking at a ship as it's flying past. So she'll actually follow the ship, and it just makes it so much more dynamic and just more real and tangible. It's really just opens it up. If you look at Idris documentation online right now, you'll see that the crew complement is supposed to be somewhere between 30 and 50. But as we were testing out the Idris and the crew and filling it up, 30 and 50 people just wasn't enough. We were walking the passageways, it just felt too empty. We didn't feel like we were getting that sense of vibrance that we wanted in life. So we added more and more people until it felt right. And now the Idris is at about 81 people, including the player. And to put that into perspective, if you look at the live stream demo, we had 12 people just on the bridge, and that was without the captain or a co-helmsman in there. So you can see how it would quickly fill up everywhere else as well.
From a designer perspective, of course, it's interesting to create a universe and an environment that is very complex, where interaction of NPC can happen, interaction with the player can happen. From a developer perspective, especially for us as an AI programmer, the interesting part is to create the tools that allow designers and also ourselves to define this world and define the restriction and define the rules where things are happening and the rules of the game, pretty much.
One of the big things we have around the Idris and throughout the game is we have what are essentially conversations where you can walk past several AI and obviously they might kind of wave or nod to you and kind of do something, but there's nothing, it's more what we call the wild line, whereas there are certain AI on the ship that have specific things they want to say to the player or even to other characters. And say like if you're the player, you walk past a certain character that has something they want to say to you, they'll actually break out of their behaviour or their activity and they'll say, actually call you over and then have a conversation with you. And these things can actually be seen by changing the depth of field with the vision. So if the player is actually looking at something, they will, like for example, in the VS demo that we showed, you can actually see Lars on the bottom of the elevator, he's in his guard post, and when you approach him, he actually reaches out to you and starts a conversation with you. And one of the things you'll notice is that the camera kind of zooms in, almost like you're then focusing on the character. And at that point, we have a conversation. We might have, like at the start of Lars's conversation, he will actually talk to you and the player will respond, and then he'll obviously finish off talking. But then partway through a conversation, there might be multiple options for a player to actually have player choice. And in this case, we'll actually pause the conversation timeline and basically wait for the player to make a decision. And then based on which decision they make, we'll actually branch out the conversations so that they could basically go down one of two paths or three or four paths, depending on obviously how many options.
Wildline is this all-encompassing term that we use for anything an AI can do as like a one-shot dialogue line to the player or to each other. So things like greetings, busies, what we call busies essentially is a AI saying, I'm busy, I can't talk. Similar to bees is another one, which is another term that we use to say, like, don't you have somewhere to be? Like, why are you lingering around? I'm doing something. Also things like mission comments. So when the player gets back from a mission, say you did really well, the player's going to comment. The AI is going to comment on that. If the player didn't do too great, then the AI is going to say, like, you kind of sucked on that last mission. Do better next time. Wildlines add a lot to AI behavior. It adds a lot of life. It means that, well, it's the difference between you walking by an AI, them looking straight forward, or them looking at the player and maybe greeting them and asking them how they are. So it adds a lot of life basically to the Idris. The way it interacts with all the primary setup is very easy. It's essentially just layered on top. The idea is once you've set up one greeting, the logic for that greeting, it can be applied to any AI who has a greeting line. So for example, Captain White, he has greetings, Kelly has greetings, all our cast characters, even some of our what we call red shirt characters who are like minor characters, they have greetings. And the good thing about the secondary logic is that once you've set it up once, it can be applied to everyone. You know, you don't have to do that setup over and over and over again.
In the perfect scenario, if the player wants to play the story as we intended, then they will have the perfect playthrough. If they want to influence the scene and the story, then they can still do it, and they will enjoy that fact that everything is systemic. It's not like a baked scene. It's really something that is using the real-time AI. So if an AI changes loadout or changes outfit, you will see that impacting the cinematic scene. Our big challenge is to make sure that this system is the most robust and stable as possible, so that designers, content creators are not worried to bring more content, are not worried about, let's say, experimenting with the gameplay, because a cool game, it's coming from experimentation and iteration. And if you don't allow people to iterate, then you pretty much are getting stuck to the first test, and then people don't want to change it, and then it's going to be like, it's not great, but if I now change this script, then everything is going to break and I don't want to do it, and we don't have time. It's really interesting for me to try to speak a lot with writers, to level designers, to system designs, to other AI programmers, because we want to make sure that everything we do doesn't have big ripple effect on the other systems, but they just build on top, they expand functionality. It's sort of composition method. So you want that every system can be composed by multiple elements, and you can create more without breaking the others. And I think this is the big, interesting challenge of Star Citizen.